a few years ago, I realized something that's a little bit hard to admit. Those of us in the conservation community, we're not that fun to be around, right? If we're not talking about climate change, we're talking about biodiversity loss. If we're not talking about that, we're talking about overdevelopment and overconsumption. And we're not the most fun people at parties. But that isn't actually the whole story, because there's actually a lot of good news in the conservation community. And so I decided to write this book about good news. And so today's presentation is really about kind of lifting you up and giving you a sense of optimism about the future. And American Prairie is a good place to be to talk about optimism for the future. I'm going to start by talking about a species that perhaps is a long way from here. I'm going to start with a species in the ocean. And of course, you're thinking, well, I'm in Lewistown, Montana. That ocean is a bit of a long way from here, but it's not that far away. If we go back 75 million years, we would have been in the western interior seaway, and there would have been plesiosaurs, like this frightening looking creature in the center of the picture. And even further back in time, 325 million years ago, in the central Montana trough, there were these cartilaginous fish, like that little fella up in the top right. Luckily for it wasn't in the water at the same time as this plesiosaur, so it's not really in danger. But anyway, I'm starting in the ocean because the ocean is the place where one of the most spectacular wildlife recoveries has happened. And let me read the first paragraph of this book of mine. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Sven Anders closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard the splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another. Then another. A fishy scent wafted shoreward. Casting his head back to the sky, Sven Anders's mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales, drawn to Norway's Kaldfjord in the winter months to feast on herring. So these humpback whales are a fantastic example of a spectacular recovery. So in the North Atlantic, where that guy Sven Anders, who I just mentioned, lives, he's in northern Norway, that population has gone from about 1,000 30 or 40 years ago to 35,000 now. In the North Pacific, so if you go up to Alaska to go whale watching, that population has gone from 1,200 to about 24,000. In the Western Indian Ocean, humpback whales have gone from 600 to 30,000. An incredible recovery. I've got a friend in Norway who said she used to have her window open every night of the year. She lives on the ocean there. But she said, there's so many whales now that if I have my window open, I can't get to sleep. How lucky to have one's dreams interrupted by whales. So whales are one of the world's tenacious beasts. They bounced back. And so my book is full of stories of animals that have bounced back. Now, to be clear, this is like my little disclaimer, like my lawyer probably advises me to put this disclaimer in. There is still a lot of bad news environmentally. 1 million species threatened with extinction. And even the species that are still around and doing okay, their abundance has gone down. So their abundance has gone down by 70% in the last 50 years. So there is a lot of bad news out there, but I think it's a double-edged sword. A lot of animals are easy to destroy, but they're spectacular in recovery too. So if we can flip the script and start those recoveries, we may be startled with the results. So in this book, what I did is I went various places, some of them close to home where I grew up. I grew up in England. I don't know if you can tell by my accent, but it is not a Western Montana accent. It's an English accent. I discovered a number of species coming back, and I cataloged them in this book. So, quick spin, a quick tour of the book. In Europe on farmland, we've got red deer and we've got Eurasian wolves. I also talked about wild boar. Here on the prairie in Montana, bison and pronghorn antelope. And I should say that my experiences with American prairie were really part of the generation of this book. They really kind of spurred me on to get these positive recovery stories going. On rivers, beavers, and on the rivers where dams have been removed, sometimes salmon. In forests, these were forests in Europe, Marsican brown bears. I'm going to say a bit more about Marsican brown bears in a bit. And barred owls in the Pacific Northwest. And that's a complex story. In oceans, those humpback whales I mentioned, also sperm whales, and sea otters. Sea otters are up from 1,000 to about 125,000 now. So that's another spectacular recovery. And once you start hearing about recoveries, they kind of show up all kinds of different places. Peregrine falcons, grizzly bears, cheetahs reintroduced to India, trumpeter swans, northern elephant seals. They're everywhere, these recoveries. And keep your ears open and you'll hear more and more of them. So somebody might say, okay, Christopher, that's fine. You've gone around, you've cherry-picked these recoveries. You're ignoring the bad news. Why should I read your book? Hope. Hope is desperately important. I talk to students. That's my day job, is to talk environmental philosophy to students at the University of Montana. And for a long time, I thought what I need to do is to tell them about things that are going wrong. And then I realized, no, I've got to tell them about things that are going right. And if they start to have hope, they can start to act towards that better future. And some people have said hope is kind of a passive emotion. You know, you sit back on your couch and you hope, you cross every digit and hope for something. But if you have hope with a vision, I think that vision can pull us all forwards. So hope is a good reason to tell these stories, reminding ourselves how biology works. And perhaps my first stab at what I mean here is to say animals want to live. They're evolutionarily evolved to figure out ways to live. And sometimes we need a reminder of that. And so this story is a reminder of what biology does and how animals work. And then finally, when an animal comes back, or when you're contemplating bringing an animal back, maybe you get a chance to think about that animal differently. Maybe you haven't been around that animal for a century. It's just been gone too long. And the only stories you've got are old stories about that animal. So maybe in 2025, soon to be 2026, we need new stories. We need new ways of thinking about animals. So, if I spend some time looking at these recoveries, what did I learn? Like, what were the sort of principles of animal recoveries that I can put down there? Well, to be honest, it's kind of complicated. It's a mixture of things. There's no one rule that works every time. But I did figure out one thing pretty quickly. And this took me many years of study and many complicated journal articles of reading to learn this. But what I've done was this. If you want animals to recover, you've got to stop killing them. And with whales, this is really obvious because in 1960s, we stopped killing those humpback whales and they immediately bounced back. That is literally all we had to do. We didn't have to restore any habitat. We didn't have to do any captive breeding of whales. We just had to stop killing them. And they immediately came back. And that's true with many other species. Bison can recover at 17% a year. A herd can grow at 17% a year. I mean, often people who run bison herds, they're confronted with the problem of like, what am I going to do with all the babies this year? I'm just going to have to, my herd is growing too quickly. So some species, you just stop killing them and they start coming back. Easy peasy. But it's not easy peasy with every species. So I mentioned earlier those Marsican brown bears in Italy. These volunteers are pruning apple trees because the apple trees are outside of town in the foothills. And they'd rather have these Marsican brown bears, of which there were only 50 for a century. So imagine that, a subspecies of brown bear, of which there's only 50 for a whole century. They'd rather have these brown bears out in the foothills than in town. Because in town, they get hit by cars, they get in trouble with people. If you can keep them out in the foothills. And these apple trees were planted 100 to 150 years ago. They're no longer used as orchards, and they've gone into senescence. So they're not producing apples anymore. But if you go out there and prune these trees, the bears love it. They're very grateful for those calories on those trees. So I was out there, I heard the stories of this Mexican bear recovery. So the latest numbers of Mexican bears, there was actually a DNA study this summer, and the results haven't been published. But I reached out to my friend out there, Mario Cipollone, and I said, Mario, what can I tell people about the recovery? And he said, you can feel confident that we've gone from 50 to 70. And, 70 is not a huge number, but it's a 40% increase. That's a pretty big increase with these bears. So thanks to Mario and the work of the volunteers, these bears are doing pretty well. I walked around that landscape with him, never saw any bears myself, but what I did see, which was incredibly exciting, was some Mexican bear poop. And we were hiking through the forest. These bears are in these beech oak forests, and they eat the acorns. They actually have a jaw that's especially shaped for eating nuts and acorns. And Mario said, oh, look, you can see in the poop where the remains of the nuts and acorns are and the berries. He said they don't have very strong digestive tracts, so the berries kind of pass through them pretty quick. And then he did something surprising. He got 2 sticks, and he bent down, and he picked up the poop. And there were 5 of us in a little group, and we were standing around. And so you imagine the 5 of us standing around this bear poop. I got a little nervous. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. But what happened next was Mario closed his eyes, breathed in, and took a sniff. And then he opened his eyes and he said, "It's like a fine wine." And he was so culturally connected to these bears. And one of the things he said to me was, if we lose these bears, we lose ourselves. I thought that was very interesting from a modern European man. If we lose these bears, we lose ourselves. Still in Europe, this is a bison, obviously, but it is a European bison, Bison bonacis. And the European bison has been returned to Kent, near where I grew up. I grew up in Sussex in southern England. My sister lives in Kent, just half an hour from where these bison have been reintroduced. And the European bison is a forest animal. So this is the place where it has been reintroduced. And if you saw a picture of a European bison next to an American bison, you would notice the European bison's legs are a little bit longer. The horns are a little bit more kind of curved around. They're a forest animal, and they often browse the mosses and lichens off the trees. Sometimes you'll see a European bison on its hind legs with its feet kind of up on the tree, kind of nibbling away at the mosses and lichens. Now, the last fossil record of bison in that part of the world is from 30,000 years ago. It was actually a different bison. It was Bison priscus, which is an ancestor. So that Bison priscus is the steppe bison. And the steppe bison is an ancestor of Bison bonacis, the European bison. But the leader of the reintroduction effort there said, we'd love to have steppe bison, but we can't. So the European bison is the best animal that we can have. When they were going to bring these animals back, they advertised for some bison ranges. Now, these were the first bison ranges that England had ever had. And so on the application, they said, looking for 2 bison rangers, no experience necessary, which was kind of a good thing, right? Because where are you going to get experienced bison rangers in England? Anyway, they brought the first bison in 2022, in the summer of 2022. They brought in 3 females to start with. And within a month, one of the females went missing. And of course, like the rangers were like, oh man, we've only been here a month and one of these bison has died on our watch. So they started looking for one of these bison, and the ranger went out there into the woods, kind of thick woods in some places. And he finally saw the bison standing up, and he saw it standing next to a little deer. And he thought, well, this is a weird thing. Why would the bison have befriended a deer? Turned out it was a bison calf. So then they were scratching their head and they were thinking, hold on, we got 3 females here. It must be an immaculate conception. Of course, no one has seen a bison in England for 30,000 years, so they were kind of unclear what was going on. But actually, this bison had come in pregnant. And of course, if you think about it, it's an advantage for a bison not to show that it's pregnant, because that perhaps doesn't give a predator a cue that there's some easy eating here. But those bison reproduced, and that herd has grown. It's up to 9 right now. And funny enough, just 3 days ago, the first matriarch, the matriarch that they brought in, died. It's kind of sad. I actually met that matriarch when she'd just been brought in. So the first of their little bison herd has died. It is they call them the first wild or semi-wild bison in the UK for 30,000 years, but there is a fence around it. So in this case, these animals come back, and you have to compromise a little bit. You have to kind of fence them in. When the winter is bad, they do a little bit of supplementary feeding. So it's not like a perfectly wild herd of bison. But the fence is important because only 4 miles from where those bison live, is Canterbury Cathedral. So they don't have a lot of space there. And you got to make sure that they're kept bounded a little bit. And they're hoping perhaps in future to have satellite-guided shot collars on these bison, so they can take the fence down, but they can keep them bounded so they don't end up getting out and towards the cathedral town of Canterbury. So in this case, here's a recovery where you've sort of got to work kind of hard at it. You got to fence them. You got to recognize that they're semi-wild, not totally wild. Elsewhere in Europe, this is in the Netherlands, actually. This guy, I wanted to put his photo up here because Oscar Campaña Cardenas, he's from Peru, living in the Netherlands. He was out here this summer. He was out at American Prairie this summer. He came with his wife, a couple of kids. He stopped with us in Missoula on the way out here. And what Oscar's doing here is he's in front of an animal that is his pride and joy. And if we zoom in on that animal, you think, oh, that looks like a sort of maybe some wild kind of cattle breed. But then if you look a little closer and if you put it up alongside that animal, does anybody know what that animal is? It's an auroch. The auroch is the ancestor of every domestic cattle breed. Bos primigenius, the first bovine. The auroch is now extinct. But what the group that Oscar works for has done is they have backbred. So they've done a complicated genetic analysis, and then they've bred together various species of wild cattle from Europe to get something that looks progressively more and more like an auroch. So alongside reintroducing bison in Europe, they're reintroducing things that are kind of like aurochs. And again, this is a case where the reintroduction, it's complicated. You got to think about land use. You got to think about neighbors. You've got to do some fancy genetic work. And you've got to just carefully monitor the reintroduction. So like compared to Wales, I put Wales up first because that one's easy. This one's a little less easy, but it can still happen. And it reminds me of this one. This is obviously something of interest to American Prairie and the new exhibit that will be opening shortly here. I mean, these little guys are kind of complicated too, aren't they? You got to do captive breeding in a very controlled way before you release them. You got to precondition them so that they're going to be ready for those release conditions. You got to vaccinate them. Sometimes you got to dust prairie dog colonies to get rid of disease. There's sort of a lot of stuff that you got to do. And if you know things about this reintroduction, it's slow. It's slow and steady. I mean, it's not easy, but we're slowly making progress on it. So this is, again, we're quite a long way away from the whales now, because you got to work real hard to make these kinds of recoveries happen. And I want one more example just to illustrate the complications. Do you know who these guys are? Does anybody want to guess? Yeah, northern spotted owls, right? And they're having a tough time. They're having a tough time because of habitat, and having a tough time because the barred owls are doing so darn well. in the Pacific Northwest now. The barred owls were not there before, but they made it across the country due to land use change in the midsection of the country. So those barred owls have made it from the northeast over to the northwest. They outcompete the northern spotted owls. You can do something about it. You can shoot the barred owls. I went out in the forest with somebody who was shooting them, and I said, "How many of these animals have you shot?" And she said, "About 350. I said, 350? I said, "I'm writing a book. Do you mind if I put that number in the book?" And she says, "No, it's okay. I know it's controversial, but I accept that if we want the spotted owls to survive, we have to shoot the barred owls." And that's not the only case where we shoot animals in order for other animals to live. So Oregon and Washington get a permit every year to shoot Steller sea lions and California sea lions to protect. Do you know what they're protecting when they shoot the sea lions? Protecting salmon runs on the Columbia. So those salmon runs are just kind of hanging on. And because there's dams that slow the salmon down, the sea lions know where to hang out. They know what's good, where the good eating is. It's at the bottom of those dams. So Oregon and Washington shoot some of the sea lions every year so that those salmon can survive. So that's a range of examples to illustrate that there's no one solution in animal recoveries. There's no one rule. But I thought, okay, I've written this book, and I'm going out there and I'm talking to people about the book. I've got to have something. I've got to have some take-home messages that people can rely on as good principles of wildlife recovery. And so since writing the book, I've come up with a few. I've come up with 3 rules. And this is what the rest of my presentation is going to be about. It's going to be about these 3 rules for animal recovery. And the first rule is this: they must live. They must live. And in a way, that's obviously sort of part of that story of stop killing them, right? They must live. We've got to be really careful when we kill animals, or even when we do it unintentionally. So in this case, that's a sperm whale that's been drowned by ropes, by fishing lines. Unintentional, but we've got to take the deaths of animals really seriously, especially when it's an animal that is hanging, teetering on the edge. So the North Atlantic right whale, it's about 370 of them left in the world. There's about 70 females of breeding age. That's all there are in the world of North Atlantic right whales. About 70. They used to reproduce every 2 or 3 years, but because of the stressors that they're subjected to, and the stress here is noise from boat traffic and changing ocean temperatures, because of those stressors, instead of reproducing every 2 or 3 years, they reproduce every 7 years. So those 70 reproductive age females are reproducing every 7 years. So any 1 year, there might be 10 that are reproducing. And so if you're going to hit one with a ship and kill it, and get one tangled in fishing lines and kill it, that 10 is now 8. So you can just imagine every life counts. They must live. If you want animals to recover, they must live. And you can pick other species about which you can say the same thing. So there's about 300 wolverines in the lower 48. And again, everyone that dies like an accidental death, hit by a car, caught in a trap or something like that, it actually matters. Really matters to the population. So the first principle is they must live, and they can live. They know how to do this. They're in the business of surviving. That's what evolution taught them to do. So if we recognize that we just need to, I think of it as like taking our foot off their backs, just like give them the breathing space where they can live, they would do pretty well. And the other element of this principle, they must live, is it's an urge for us to remember compassion. Remember to sort of think about the lives of animals. And when you think about that whale caught up in those lines, right? Whales are intelligent, social, long-lived animals. Bowhead whales. You know how long bowhead whales live? 200 years. Bowhead whales can live 200 years. super smart, super social, super long-lived. Imagine what it's like if you're a bowhead whale tangled in ropes and over a period of 3 or 4 weeks drowned by the weight of those ropes. So thinking about compassion is the other part of they must live. And so compassion might mean fencing your beehives so that you don't get a bear in trouble. It might mean leashing your dog so that your dog isn't chasing. Here we are on some dunes in the upper Midwest on the Great Lakes, so that your dog isn't smashing shorebirds nesting on the shore. It might mean providing access through culverts if we're talking about rivers and creeks and fish movement. So they must live. That's principle 1 of wildlife recovery. Principle 2, they must roam. They must be able to move. It's not just enough that they live. They must be able to move between connected spaces, especially important when you think about climate change, where conditions on the ground are changing. Animals need to be able to move. And we're slowly getting the hang of that idea. This is, has anyone passed under this wildlife overcrossing just north of Missoula, when you go from Missoula up into the Flathead there? This is on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes Reservation, the Flathead Reservation. They've actually got money for a second overpass. It's just the coolest thing. This is the only overpass in Montana built by the tribe, and they're going to build a second one 30 miles north of this, near Nine Pipes Reservoir. Most of the wildlife crossings in Montana are underpasses. And so whenever you're driving down the road and you see 8-foot-high fences, you can probably keep your eyes open. You'll see a place where there's an underpass, and those fences are shepherding animals towards those underpasses. So this is Montana. This is Colorado. This is also Colorado, where this December, supposedly next month, this enormous wildlife crossing over I-25 is going to be finished. This is California, where this giant crossing, which is supposed to help mountain lions just north of LA, Highway 101, the Wallace-Annenberg crossing, is going to be built. We seem to be kind of getting the hang of the they must roam principle. We're doing better on this at the moment. Now, if you're not a terrestrial animal, but you're a fish, they must roam means not building something, but taking something down. So that's the Copco Dam on the Klamath River. They must roam means allowing those fish to move. And out at American Prairie, they must roam means taking fences down. Or at least if the fence has to stay up, making it a wildlife-friendly fence. And so this work is happening out here too. So like I say, we're doing a little bit better on this second principle. They must roam. A couple of other examples of helping animals roam. Here we're in Scotland. And this is sort of a classic picture of a Scottish landscape in the Highlands there. Heather, wind-swept, bleak hillsides. And of course, I grew up thinking this was a classic, ecologically healthy Scottish landscape, but it's actually an ecological desert because the Caledonian forest, which looks like that, should be there. And so the Caledonian forest, there's only one native conifer in Scotland, the Scots pine. Those Scots pine seedlings are still in the soil, even though those trees often haven't been there for a century or so. But if you can keep those red deer that I mentioned that are doing so well, those red deer are stopping the Caledonian forest coming back. So you've got to take proactive measures to suppress the red deer population to let that forest come back. That forest is a mixture of Scots pine, birch, what they call rowan, rowanberry, mountain ash, aspen. I never knew growing up that Scotland was home to aspen. And there's a Scottish rewilding group having they call it the Paint Scotland Yellow campaign right now. They're wanting to get aspen back in Scotland. And this place I visited, they're trying to bring the forest back, and you can see that the forest is coming back here. So here you're not building infrastructure, but you're restoring ecological structure. And by restoring the ecological structure, you let animals like this come back. The Scottish wildcat, which actually just looks like a tabby cat. It's about this big. But next up, once they got this guy back, they're going to try to bring the lynx back. So, stepping up a little bit in their wildlife game. So letting ecological structure come back is part of letting them roam. You can do it on a big scale, like a whole Scottish valley, like that one I showed you. You can do it on the scale of Brewery Flats over there that my wife and I really enjoyed spending time there this morning, kind of like a mid-scale. Or you can do it on a small scale. Here we are in Scotland again. This is the red squirrel. Red squirrel is struggling a little bit. They're struggling a little bit because invasive American gray squirrels are hammering the red squirrels. But people have woken up to bringing red squirrels back. And there's an interesting ecological connection here. If you bring pine martens back, so there's a few pine martens in the UK that are starting to recover a little bit. These red squirrels evolved with the pine martens, and so they know how to dodge the pine martens. But the American gray squirrels that have invaded this area, they don't know how to dodge the pine martens. So just bringing the pine martens back has helped the red squirrels. But what's also helped them is people like this guy. So the guy in the middle with the kilt on, the guy kind of gazing out there talking to us, he's actually called Hamish, which, you go to Scotland and you imagine everyone's called Hamish in Scotland and they all wear kilts. And I'm like, oh yeah, that guy actually was called Hamish and he did wear a kilt. And he's talking about the 60 acres of land he owns. And what he's pointing out to us there is an open field on which he's going to plant 6 Scots pines in a line. And what those 6 Scots pines are going to allow is it's going to allow the red squirrels that are down in the valley bottom to make it up to the top of the hillside there, where there's a forest that they'd be happy to live in. Right now, they can't make that journey. What I just thought was cool about this was he's talking about 6 trees. He's not talking about restoring a whole ecosystem, but he's talking about 6 trees which will let those red squirrels roam. Animals don't need much. They know how to do this. And broadening that picture of they must roam, these maps are from the Audubon Society. Those little yellow dots are collars on migrating birds. This particular, you can go onto the Audubon Society website and look at a number of these maps. This particular one is the black-poll warbler. And I think if this works, yeah, here we go. Watch these birds migrate. Those are individual birds migrating. And you could spend hours looking at these Audubon Society maps. So they're on their summer grounds there up in the north, and then they return to their breeding grounds. And these maps are giving us a real sense of migration, of how things move. There's places in Pennsylvania where they've counted bird migrations, and they're talking about 1 million birds an hour migrating over one spot in Pennsylvania. Just one night. Most of the time we're not aware. We're not seeing them, of course. Sometimes you hear them. Sometimes you can hear those geese migrating at night. 1 million birds an hour. Think of rivers of birds moving across the landscape. Let's go into the oceans and think of whales moving across the landscape. So these are whale migrations. And I see these 2 maps and I'm thinking of balls of wool, and that wool kind of linking, like holding those balls of wool together. And isn't it the same as what's happening here? These birds, these whales are binding the earth into one earth. They're bringing it all together. They're connecting the places that we live in. And there's astonishing science out there showing us that this stuff happens. These maps are helpful also because we're not going to be able to save every square inch of land and give it over to recovering wildlife. But if we can be smart about saving the most important pieces of land, then that's going to go a long way. If we can save the refueling stops for some of these animals, then we can help them migrate and we can help them bind the earth together to make it into one earth. So I've done 2 principles so far. I've got 1 more. They must live. They must roam. And the 3rd principle is we must change. So the first two principles are really directly focused on the animals. They must live, they must roam. The third one is focused on us. We must change. And what I mean here is not just, okay, we got to change to let them live. We got to change to let them roam. But what I mean is we got to change how we think about animals, our whole relationship with the animal world. We've got to recalibrate that relationship. And I wanted to illustrate that with my own experience. So going back to that funny accent I have, right? So British, grew up, I came over to the United States for graduate school when I was 22 years old. And in those first 21 years, I lived on a landscape where if I went walking in the middle of the night through the forest, the most frightening animal I might bump up against would be a rabbit. Well, I could have bumped up against a fox and possibly a badger, but badger, fox, rabbit, that was kind of it. The landscape was devoid of anything else. And I moved over to the United States and I went to graduate school in Colorado. And I started going to Alaska, and then I was in Oregon for a while. Now I'm in Montana. And so I had to change how I thought about animals. Because I grew up thinking that, for example, black bears, and I feel a little embarrassed saying this because, I'm in front of a room full of people who live in Montana, and I'm going to tell you what this poor English guy thought about black bears. But when I arrived here, I thought if I went out of my house and there weren't any people around, a black bear was going to jump out from behind a bush and take me down and drag me off and eat me. I mean, I really thought that. And I've met other people who thought this too. People from New York City who moved to Missoula. I've literally been told I was worried when I took my trash out at night, worried about the bears in Missoula. Now, of course, that's an overreaction, but that is how you think about animals if you grow up in a place like England or in a place like New York City. This is taken by the University of Montana campus photographer. This black bear is in a Norway maple. Of course, a Norway maple is not a native tree to Western Montana. That's a street tree. And this black bear got out of that street tree and wandered across the street onto campus. And you can see in the background there with her backpack on, there's a student heading to class as this black bear presumably is not heading to class, but the black bear heads onto campus. This was 2022 when the huckleberry crop failed. And it was estimated there were between 150 and 200 black bears in Missoula for a month. It was kind of crazy. They were showing up everywhere. They were showing up at the bakeries at night when the bakeries were sort of throwing out the extra bread and cakes that didn't get eaten. They were literally everywhere. But in that whole month, they didn't injure or even frighten anybody. There were no bad encounters at all. None. That helped me rethink how I thought about black bears. And really, black bears are in Missoula the whole time. This was the following year. And this is also on campus. There's also some students in the background there. And so I've slowly come to rethink my concept of the black bear. I still respect them enormously. I mean, my wife and I never go on a hike or a bike ride without carrying bear spray. We always make noise if we're in a blind corner. And I'm well aware that a bear can be dangerous, but my head is not in that same space that it was in 25 years ago, 30 years ago, actually, when I came to the United States. I have literally changed how I think about animals. And I mentioned that time period, 25 to 30 years, because that's how long it has taken me to change how I think about animals. And I think that's maybe helpful just to sort of think about cultural change. Like, how long does cultural change take to happen? Several decades, perhaps. And you got to be in it for the long haul for that change to happen. And how does it happen? It happens because you pay attention to the facts. So, I mean, one interesting fact about black bears is in North America, there's about 800,000 of them. And they're around about 375 million people. And they kill less than 2 people a year. Fact. 800,000 bears, 375 million people, less than 2 people a year. Cattle kill about 20 people a year in the United States. Dogs kill between 30 and 40 people a year in the United States. My point is, if I had to have an animal in my living room, would I choose a bear over a cow or a dog? No, of course not. But if I had to get really wound up about, where my public dollars should go, or, what we should be focusing on, I think there's a case that, we might want to focus on the injuries that happen through dogs, as well as the injuries that happen through bears. I mean, it just might be sensible based on the facts. So that change happens slowly. But for me, this has been instructive because it's changing how I think about bears. Here's another example. Beavers. These 2 beaver dams are taken within about 5 miles of where I live in Missoula, and they're taken in places where human-built dams have been removed. So the Milltown Dam has been removed off the Clark Fork River in the top right there. That's like a side channel of the Clark Fork. And the Rattlesnake Dam has been removed off Rattlesnake Creek, and that's the picture on the left. Took that picture about 2 weeks ago. The head on that beaver dam is about 5 feet. It's incredible. And what's happened is the beaver has built a dam to help, not intentionally, and in the process of building that dam, helping that creek recover. So that creek is being restored with the help of beavers. And we know the ecological services that beavers provide: fire breaks, fish habitat, helping with the water table, filtration, complexity, all these things that beavers do. And so we're learning from beavers. And you've noticed there's been this real turnaround. People are generally, not always, but generally pretty positive about beavers. Beavers can teach us things about how to restore ecosystems. So beavers as teachers. It's interesting, an interesting different way to think about animals. Ben Goldfarb, who wrote that fantastic book, Eager, says, let the beaver do the work. Let the beaver restore these creeks and show us how to do it. Beavers as teachers. Whales as partners. These are sperm whales pooping, mixing nutrients into the ocean. So sperm whales feed at depth and they poop up at the surface. They're bringing nutrients that gravity has sent to the bottom of the ocean. They're bringing them back up to the top of the ocean. That helps phytoplankton grow. Those phytoplankton suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. These whales are actually helping with the carbon problem. Whales as partners, whales as helpers. This is out on Beaver Creek in the Dry Fork unit. I was out 2 summers ago, I think it was, out on American Prairie Landscape. And Danny Kinker, the ecologist, showed me this spot because he said, since the bison have been on this spot, the vegetation in this creek has broadened. The vegetation has got further and further away from the creek as the moisture stays closer on that landscape. So these bison are helping harden this landscape against drier summers. And what they're also doing, we found a beaver dam, Danny and I. So those bison are preparing ground that let beavers do their thing. So you got bison as helpers, beavers as teachers, these different ways of thinking about animals. Alaska means a lot to me. Think of these fish as spreading nutrients into the forest. One black bear can bring 700 fish into the forest. 70% of the nitrogen in a coastal forest in Alaska comes from the fish. So think of these fish as, I don't literally want you to think of the fish as a bag of fertilizer, but you kind of get the idea. The fish are helping bring nutrients onto that landscape. So these changes can happen. And in England, I mentioned those bison. Beavers can now legally be restored. What they call elk. So British people call those elk. It's kind of weird. I'd call them a moose, but British people call them elk. And those lynx I was talking about. Compared to when I grew up, for me, it was rabbits and foxes. For my sister's children, it's bison, lynx, moose, and beavers. Changing how we think about animals, changing how we think about our surroundings. So I want to end with this and a story about the bear. So I, as I wrote this book and as I thought about animal recovery, I thought, we must change. And I've done some changing, myself. I've done some changing how I think about animals. But I have a long way to go. And I want to just close with this illustration. A friend of mine takes students into the Bob Marshall Wilderness with the Wild Rockies Field Institute. I don't know if you've heard about that organization. It's like field experiences for students. A lot of them come from the East Coast. Before they go into the Bob, they do some bear safety training. So with this one morning, they did some bear safety training. In the afternoon, they talk with a Blackfeet tribal member about what it's like living there. When that tribal member asked for questions, a hand shot up, and one of the students from the East Coast said, "What's it like to live around brown bears? Must be terrifying." And the Blackfeet elder listens to the question and said, "You're asking me, am I frightened living here on the Rocky Mountain front around these brown bears?" And the student's like, "Yeah, you must be absolutely terrified." And the tribal member said, "Oh, actually, no. We're not frightened of these bears because we think the bears protect us." So that's changing how we think about animals. So thanks for your attention, and I'd certainly be happy to take questions if you have any.